The emerald ash borer is a destructive, highly invasive, non-native insect that in less than a decade can decimate a city's ash tree population. By the time it's discovered, it's already too late for many trees. The emerald ash borer was confirmed in Dubuque County in 2015, and evidence of it just a year later is staggering. I'm Randy Gale, and with me today to discuss this problem is Park Division Manager Steve Faisal and City Forester Steve Pregler. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Randy.
Well, let's start with some basic background on the emerald ash borer. How did it get here and why is it so destructive?
Well, to begin with, the emerald ash borer is an insect. It's a small green emerald-colored beetle that's approximately a half-inch long. Now, this insect is native to Asia, and it's not native to the United States. And it was first discovered in the United States back in 2002 in the Detroit, Michigan area. And they began noticing that their ash trees were declining and dying off. And one of the curious things that someone picked up on was there was an awful lot of woodpecker activity and woodpeckers getting fat. And so they called in some of the entomologists from local university, and they did some investigating and determined that indeed the decline of the ash trees was caused by an insect which they had no knowledge of. And so they dug a little bit deeper, went to the Smithsonian Institute where they have the largest insect collection around, and were able to identify that it was this emerald ash borer, but there was very little, if any, information that could be found on the insect concerning its life cycle, what problems it may have caused. And in fact, in Asia, the insect really doesn't cause a problem for them, and the primary reason for that is because there were a number of natural predators that keep the population of the insect under control or in check. Here in the United States, the insect doesn't have that pressure from the predators other than some woodpeckers and maybe some wasps that we've imported from Asia and brought over here and are experimenting with to see if they would establish here and also become a natural control so that we can slow the spread of the emerald ash borer down. Since 2002, the insect has just spread out in all directions, and it currently is found in 25 different states, including the state of Iowa. And the reason for the spread, we figure, is because the insect is being transported in its larval stage, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in firewood. And so it's moved all throughout the country. And in fact, the way it got to the United States was it was transported in wood pallets or shipping, packing, crating type materials as the larva came here and then pupated, turned into the adult, spread out. And that's how we figure that the insect population was first established here in the United States. Here in Iowa, back in 2010, it was first discovered in Allamakee County. And then for a couple of years, it didn't do much. It just kind of moved around the county, but it didn't move out of the county. Then in about 2013, we saw maybe 8 or 9 other counties within the state of Iowa become infested. In 2014 and 2015, each of those years, about another 10 counties had discovered and confirmed the emerald ash borer's presence. And then later on in 2015, we actually discovered it here in Dubuque County, down on the south edge of Dubuque. Now, what makes this insect so destructive? Number one, we kind of touched on that a little bit. There are no natural predators around here to control the population. And one thing about the emerald ash borer's reproduction is that they reproduce exponentially. And for example, if we have one female adult will lay approximately 100 eggs, 56% of those eggs will be other females, and then they multiply each year by a factor of 10. And right now, in year 4, and we figure that with some of these early infestations, we're probably around year 4 or 5, but we could be at a population level of possibly 56,000 emerald ash borers, or as much as 560,000 in year 5, and it just keeps, multiplying. So, that it's just out of control, and there really are no controls that we've found since it was initially introduced into the United States to stop or try to eradicate the emerald ash borer. So now the game plan is just to try to manage it and slow the spread if we can. And even though it's been around for a little over a decade, we're learning a lot about it. We're experimenting with a number of things, and hopefully as time goes on, we'll find something that will help us to save some of our native ash species, because without it we're going to lose them all.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up my next question. When we look at the city of Dubuque itself, how many trees will this infestation affect?
Well, there are two answers to that. One is, overall as a community, hundreds if not thousands of trees, because it will affect all ash trees within the ash genus, which is Fraxinus. And that would encompass the trees that we commonly know as mostly as our green and our white ash. There are other ash trees that it would affect, but the green and white ash are the ones that we primarily have in the area, the ones that we've used in our landscapes and when people are most familiar with. So there are thousands of them, on our hillsides, as native trees, and they were used extensively after we lost our elm tree population back in the 50s and 60s due to the Dutch elm disease. So there are just, untold, numbers out there. As far as city trees go that we are responsible for, we've done an inventory a few years back, and we estimate that we have about 1,750 ash trees that are located either as street trees on public right-of-way or on other developed city properties that we have that we'll be caring for. And that doesn't include roadside ditches, other undeveloped right-of-ways, that type of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll switch Steve's for the next question here. Steve, how will the city combat this infestation?
So one of the things the city did back in January of 2015 was adopted an emerald ash borer readiness plan. The readiness plan gets us basically prepared to fight EAB once it has been found, spells out different options for treatment, control, wood processing, as well as policies related to tree removals, funding options. So we're working through that plan right now, since EAB was found in Dubuque in August of 2015. As far as combating it as a city, we will specifically be focusing on our street trees and our park trees and other city property trees. We have been able to purchase an injection system, so we are injecting small to medium-sized healthy ash trees. We're also soil drenching some of those small to medium-sized ash trees. The other part of it is we're also, with Steve's expertise, he has performed a great inventory of the health of the trees and whether they are in poor condition, fair condition, good condition. And based on those ratings, poor condition trees most likely we will be removing, and we've actually started removing some of those. We've actually removed about between 30 and 40 trees at Flora Park this winter. There are a number of ash trees in Flora Park, and we've also started removing a number of ash trees along city streets. Some of the other things we're doing in-house as a city is as our equipment comes up for replacement, we're looking at how do we best purchase new equipment to help us combat this as a city, Could be larger equipment, could be different equipment, and those types of things. We'll also be working through some additional policies and funding options as we move forward to make sure that we can stay proactive.
Let's go in a little more detail here about how does this insect actually kill the trees or damage them?
Well, the emerald ash borer, we see it basically in two different phases of its life cycle. We'll see it as the adult insect, and the adult really doesn't cause a problem for our ash trees. When it feeds, it will feed on the foliage of the trees, and we'll just see little, notches where the insect has fed. The real problem is with the larval stage of the insect's life cycle. The adult insect lays its eggs in the cracks or fissures on the bark of the tree. Those eggs hatch, and then they chew their way into the underside of the bark, into an area that we call a cambium. And the cambium is a layer of rapidly growing cells that are able to differentiate themselves, and the cells on the inside form the new sap conductive tissue that conducts the water and mineral elements up the tree's trunk throughout the branches and crown to the leaves, so that the tree's energy can be manufactured through a process of photosynthesis. And then on the outside part of the cambium, or the inner bark of the tree, is tissue that we call the phloem. And the phloem is the tissue then that conducts that manufactured energy and some of the growth hormones and that regulate the tree's growth back down the trunk of the tree. Now, because this area is actively growing, it's energy rich, and so these larvae are eating their way through those layers just beneath the bark of the tree and creating what we call galleries. And those galleries are typically S-shaped or in serpentine fashion, and we'll show you some of those. And as they're doing that, they're actually cutting off that transport system in the tree, both for water moving up the tree and the photosynthate or carbohydrates moving back down the tree. And once the tree then becomes infested with literally thousands of these larvae, each of these galleries, they begin to kind of coalesce because there are so many of them. They just completely cut off the sap flow of the tree and kill the tree.
And now I see you've brought some samples with you today to kind of show us what you're talking about. Let's take a look at those now.
Sure. I've brought a branch that I've removed from one of our infested ash trees, and you can see that this is one of the S-shaped or serpentine galleries that we're finding that is indicative or a sign that, yes, we're dealing with the emerald ash borer, because a number of the native ash or native borers that do attack the ash trees, their galleries are much different. None of those insect larvae create this typical gallery right here. So as you can see, there's one here, there's one here, and eventually the limb or the trunk of the tree will just become filled with those galleries, and they're typically about maybe 5 or 6 inches long, each individual gallery, and maybe 2.5 inches wide. So it doesn't take very long for those branches and trunk to just be, rendered non-productive anymore.
Especially as you mentioned, if one female lays hundreds of eggs or thousands, and you just multiply that throughout the entire tree, you can see why it's so destructive. Well, speaking of these ash trees, how do you identify an ash tree? For the average resident who's watching this program may be wondering, is that an ash tree I have in my yard? How can they determine if they have an ash tree that may be susceptible to this?
Well, first I might point out that the City of Dubuque, on the City of Dubuque's website, if they go to the Leisure Services and Parks Department, click on that, and then on the left-hand side, click on Trees, and then click on the Emerald Ash Borer link. There will be a number of documents there, and we do have a document posted on there that will go through and show different parts or aspects of the tree that are make it identifiable as an ash. I did bring a couple of things here. This is a branch from an ash tree, and most trees will have branches where their buds and branches, rather than come out opposite of one another, they'll grow alternately on the branch. And so it's mostly the maples and the ash trees that have this opposite branching. And so that's one way to tell. Usually the buds and the flowers are very distinctive. The seeds that they produce are very distinctive. They're kind of long, maybe 1.5 inches long and wing-like, and they're usually occurring in clumps on the tree. And then the leaves are very distinctive, and that's probably one of the more distinctive aspects. And this is your typical ash leaf, and the ash leaf will have a center stem, as we see here, and then we'll have a number of individual leaflets. And there could be 7 leaflets, or there could be 9 leaflets on the leaf, but it's very distinctive.
Okay, yeah. Well, now that we've told residents how they can determine if they have an ash tree, how do they determine if their ash tree is infested?
Okay, that's been something that's been very difficult, even for the professionals. And one of the things that we're still researching is, how can we tell when the tree has been infested very early on. Usually we don't know that the tree's been infested until maybe 4 years later, when some of the symptoms, and by symptoms I mean how is the tree responding to the presence of the insect. Because the insect is in there cutting off that transport system, the branches and foliage aren't getting the water that they would need, and so the leaves would maybe begin to wilt. You'd notice some dieback in the tree's crown. The tree, as branches die, will start producing some epicormic or sucker growth. Usually we see that down in the lower crown of the tree, where some of those bigger lateral branches begin to branch away from the trunk, and we'll see it on the trunk of the tree. But these are all symptoms, and those symptoms can also be produced by our native borers, so they're not really indicative of the emerald ash borer. So one of the main things that we've been finding is that when we go out and survey or scout our ash trees, we're looking for areas up in the crown of the tree where there's been woodpecker flecking, where they've pecked and removed the bark, and pretty soon you have bark all over the ground beneath the tree, and the upper limbs will take on kind of a whitish appearance then, where that bark has been flecked away. And so that's one of the earlier, you could maybe call it a sign that yes, maybe we do have the emerald ash borer. And then to confirm it, we need to get up into the crown of the tree and take a closer look. And we've also found that in that area where they've done their flecking, they've also drilled the holes so that they could get at the larva beneath the trunk of the tree. And so they're producing a hole that's approximately maybe 1/2 inch in diameter, maybe a little bit more oval shaped. And I brought another branch with me here showing, and sometimes it's just a very subtle spot where the particular woodpecker has flecked the bark away, but you can see where it's been flecked away, and you can also see the hole there. And sometimes the bark will begin to split at that same in that same area because the bark is no longer strongly attached. It's all dead underneath from the gallery making of the larva. And then what we'll do to confirm it is take a draw knife or a pocket knife and start shaving away layers of the bark until we get down to that area and see those serpentine type galleries. In the process, oftentimes we'll even find the larva, beneath the bark of the tree, and that's the primary confirmation for us. In order to be declared an infested county, you have to produce one of the life stages of the insect itself. That has to be sent to the Smithsonian Institute, where entomologists there confirm whether or not indeed it is an emerald ash borer larva or adult, or whatever the case may be. So.
Okay. Now, Steve, you talked before about the city's plan and how we're going to fight the infestation or try to manage the infestation on city property. What advice would you offer to private citizens who may identify an infested tree on their private property?
Our best advice is to contact a certified arborist. They are certified to positively identify the emerald ash borer. We do have on our webpage, as Steve mentioned, we do have a listing of businesses doing tree work in Dubuque, and on that list there's also some certified arborists. So the first best bet is to call a certified arborist to make sure that it can be confirmed.
Okay.
And I might add to that the listing that we do have, those folks have provided us with proof of both liability and workman's compensation insurance, and they're established companies here in Dubuque. One of the things I might point out is that now that we do have it, there's a lot of money to be made, and so we see a lot of illegitimate companies, coming into town. A lot of times they'll just be out knocking on doors, offering to either remove the tree or treat the tree, and they're really scam artists, and that's something for people to be aware of.
That's very good advice. Come back to you, Steve. I think you kind of touched on this before. Are there current insects native to North America that do similar type of damage to trees? It sounds like there may be a native ash borer as well, or are there other insects that do this type of damage?
Yes, there are, and each of these insects too, their larvae would attract the woodpeckers. So, again, until you actually do some of that bark skinning and find that S-shaped gallery beneath the bark, we don't know really which one it is. There are a number of other both wood borers, and there is a bark beetle that also will attack the ash trees. Most of them are what we call opportunistic insect pests, meaning they'll only take advantage of trees that have already been greatly stressed, say by a drought or through substantial construction, injury to the tree's root system or something like that, making them more susceptible and attractive to these native borers. Some of them are, they're a round-headed borer as opposed to the emerald ash borer, which is a flat-headed borer. And we'll see when these insects, when they turn back into the adult, they have to chew their way out of the tree again, and so they leave what we call an emergence hole. And the emerald ash borer's hole will be, because it's a flat-headed borer, will be flat on one side or very D-shaped. Whereas some of the other borers, they'll be either round or a little bit more oval-shaped.
Okay. You mentioned the Dutch elm disease that killed so many trees, in the 50s and 60s. How would you compare this infestation to that issue?
In general, it's going to do to the ash trees what Dutch elm disease did with the elm trees. It'll basically wipe them out. And if they're unprotected, the difference is back in the Dutch elm disease days, our use of insecticides and the way we delivered the insecticides to the tree weren't very refined, and they almost did as much damage to the trees as what the insect and the disease microorganism did to the tree. Today we do have effective insecticides and delivery systems that do work very well. But in sheer numbers, yeah, it's very comparable.
Okay. Steve, come back to you for a question. You talked about some options for citizens who have ash trees that are infested on private property. Are they obligated to treat or remove those trees?
They are not obligated to treat or remove. However, again, we would recommend they contact a certified arborist to come out and take a look at the tree, and if it's a tree that the arborist feels could be successfully treated, hopefully I would recommend that they would do that to keep that tree, hopefully prolong the life, or maybe that tree might survive. Now on the flip side of that, if there is a private tree that does die and becomes a public hazard, for instance, maybe fall on the sidewalk or become a hazard, then we do have the authority in the city's ordinance to send them a letter and tell them that they need to remove the tree. So they do need to be very cognizant if it's a tree in their yard that's close to a sidewalk or something similar where it could fall on someone or something could happen. We do enforce that ordinance and send letters out telling them the tree would need to be removed.
Okay. There is I might add, the trees will become a liability for them, so if it's hanging over the neighbor's house or yard where it could damage a fence or a shed or little kids playing out in the yard, they have to be very aware of that too. And one of the things that we found, like with the elm trees, once that tree dies and it starts losing its bark, the branches become very brittle and are lost during the storms, and even sometimes it doesn't even take much of a storm, and the tree begins falling apart and becoming very dangerous. And one of the things that some of these communities that have experienced the emerald ash borer early on is that the trees are dying in a similar way where they're becoming very dangerous, whereas if the tree had died maybe of another reason, it wouldn't fall apart quite as fast. So it does become a liability very quickly.
That's a very valid point that people need to be aware of. As the city's removing some of these ash trees that we're not treating, I'm sure you're making decisions about how to replace those trees. What are some best practices in terms of developing an urban canopy as you look at the community as a whole in managing our trees?
There are a number of things that we need to look at in order to be, real competent managers. And one of the first things is we always tell people match the tree to the site. In other words, if we have a heavy clay soil, we don't want to plant a tree that has been genetically adapted to growing in, say, a sandy loam soil, that they're just not going to adapt to that site. Likewise, we don't want to plant a large evergreen as a foundation planting. It just doesn't fit the site. It's going to grow into the house and be a problem. And so we try to do that with our street trees also. We try to match them to the site. We take a look at the soil type. We take a look at, do we have overhead utility lines that the tree may interfere with, so we're going to choose trees that are a little bit smaller in stature. We're taking a look at the width of the planting lawn, just how much real growing space, will that tree have. And so some of the forest giants, are kind of out because they'd be the first ones to cause substantial damage to our infrastructure. Another thing that we always like to push is to use native plants, when we can, so that we don't end up with some of these invasive species type problems. And even some of the trees that we've used in the past as city street trees are actually non-natives. For example, the Norway maple is not a native tree, and it's establishing in some of our woodlands now as understory trees, and they just don't fit into that ecosystem in that wooded area. And we're also finding now that one of our beautiful spring trees that'll be blooming very soon here now, the ornamental pear, we're finding that that's become a very invasive species on us, and they're kind of reverting back to some of the qualities that they had prior to their being bred, for our use with, more attractive qualities. Mm-hmm. So, we have to kind of balance those types of things. And another thing that we want to do here too is we want to diversify our community's tree planting so that we don't end up with a problem like this where we've relied on a high percentage of ash trees for so long, because now we have this emerald ash borer that comes in that will wipe out the entire genus. And we have that same potential with the Asian longhorn beetle which they've been managing to kind of quarantine in certain areas, but at some point it may get away and spread out, and that could really wipe out our maple trees and a number of other trees, because that insect isn't quite so host specific as what the emerald ash borer. It's got a taste for a number of different tree species. And another thing I might point out too, it gets a little bit more technical, but it's something that has to really be kept in mind, is that when we're talking about diversifying, we're not talking about saying instead of just using all Freeman maples and then occasionally some sugar maples or Norway maples. We're not diversifying by choosing a different species. We have to choose a completely different genus of tree.
Well, kind of a good segue for my final question, I guess. Will the emerald ash borer ever be eradicated, or is this something we're just going to have to, it's going to run its course, kind of like Dutch elm disease did? What do you see in the future for this problem?
Well, I think it's already a pretty well established fact that we never will eradicate it. So the management plan is right now to attempt to slow the spread, and we're really not far along enough there yet to say whether we have good methods and that that is going to be as successful as what we would like. In the end, I think we're going to possibly see the emerald ash borer much like we view the Japanese beetle. Some years, it'll be a real annoying pest, and other years, we may not have many problems with it, depending upon how it survives.
Okay. Well, thank you both for sharing so much information today. It's a problem that's literally going to change the landscape of our community over the years, it sounds like, and a lot of good information for residents to keep in mind as they see the city doing what it can to address the problem, and also information for them to consider as they're looking at their properties as well. So, do you have anything to add before we sign off?
No, thank you. Thanks for having us today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for watching City Journal.